Morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Ross, and on behalf of SPSP, we want to welcome you and appreciate your participating in this webinar. We intend to have a lot of webinars this year, we hope, and there's lots of things to talk about. Within the newsletter, we have asked and will ask for suggestions for topics you'd like to hear or speakers you'd like to hear from. And certainly if people are willing to be speakers, let us know that too. So let me get started on the program. Now, I've been a product safety lawyer for over 40 years and have had dealings with the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission since the late 1970s. While the people have changed, the mission of the CPSC and its main activities have stayed consistent. But it is the people that drive the CPSC, and the changes in the political party in charge recently and changes in career employees have changed the focus and goals of the CPSC over time. So we thought now was a good time in light of the change of administrations and some changes in personnel to talk about what effect these are going to have on future activities and dealings with the CPSC over the next 4 years. Now, the speakers and I am lawyers, we're all lawyers, and in the product safety area, we do a lot of predicting of the future. Although I will say that there's no law school class on how to predict the future, but that's what we get to do. And that's what our speakers are going to get to do. So these are predictions about what could happen since we're early in the change of administration. So let me introduce the two speakers. First, Neal Cohen. Neal has served as a senior legal advisor in the CPSC's Office of Compliance and as an enforcement attorney in the Office of General Counsel. In addition, he was the Small Business Ombudsman, and Neal was the creator and lead author of CPSC's Regulatory Robot. Neal is now a principal at Neal Cohen Law. Our second speaker, Mike Gentine, has served 2 CPSC commissioners, most recently as senior counsel to Commissioner Joe Maharovic. Mike is now counsel at Keller and Heckman. As Loudon mentioned, you can submit your questions through the chat function, and we will stop 10 to 15 minutes before the end, no matter where we are in our agenda, to see if there's some questions, and we appreciate that. Now, this session is being sponsored by Sedgwick Brand Protection, which is formerly Stericycle Expert Solutions, and we thank Sedgwick Brand Protection for their sponsorship. As Loudon mentioned, the webinar will be archived on the SPSP website in case you have others in your organization who want to see the webinar. In future newsletters for SPSP, you'll be receiving more information concerning future webinars. And as I said, we hope to do them more frequently this year, either every month or every other month. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the passing of Dave Schmeltzer, one of the original employees of the CPSC and the former head of compliance for many, many years. Anybody who knew Dave knew that he was a great guy, a great advocate for product safety, and we will all miss him. I wanted to ask Neal, who knew Dave pretty well, to say a few words about him.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, we just, in preparing, we wanted to acknowledge, I know many of you know of David Schmeltzer, have met him at ICFSO or met him through his many, many years at the CPSC. I did not have the benefit of working with him for 40 years. I mean, he is sort of known in the sort of founding generation of product safety, the pioneers, they call themselves, the product safety pioneers. But he was a gentleman in all senses of the word and extremely dedicated to the cause of product safety. And I recall meeting him very early on in my work in this field, and wherever I was, David was always there as well. And just had a steadfast commitment to protecting consumers and, really led the way in the creation of this field, leading at CPSC for so many years. So we just wanted to take a moment before proceeding just to acknowledge his passing. He passed away last week after a stroke, but he had survived many other challenges in his life, and he leaves behind his wife and his son with whom he was very close. Thank you.
Thank you, Neal. Okay, well, let's get started. So we have a change of administrations, changes in Congress, and I want to call first on Mike to talk about sort of the high-level predictions or speculation on what may happen with the leadership of the CPSC, and then also what effect their relationship with Congress, how that might change. Okay, Mike.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Neal, as well, for joining in. Thanks to everybody at SPSP, especially Don and Loudon, for putting this together and for inviting me to join. And yeah, I think, Ken, the short answer is, unfortunately, that Crystal Ball 101 class just did not happen, at least in my law school experience. So my accuracy is going to be a little bit limited here, but I think, what's clear is obviously we have one open seat at the commission already. We have Elliot Kay, who is into his holdover year that will expire at the end of October. Bob Adler, the acting chairman, his term will expire in October, and then he'd have potentially a holdover year of 2 years. So we've got a lot of opportunity for turnover. I know Bob has said he's not interested in being renominated. I think there are some question marks around on Elliot's ability if a renomination were to come his way. So we can anticipate there are going to be a lot of new faces at the commission level. What I haven't heard is a great deal of chatter from the Biden administration on who they may be looking at. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. I think number one is the odd structure of the transition team and where CPSC was placed in that. I think Neal wants to opine a little bit more on that as well. But we've heard some names generally from the consumer advocacy community, from the public health community, none very concretely at this point. Of course, an incoming administration in any era has bigger fish to fry than CPSC, but from the CPSC insider or CPSC community perspective, things are, pretty urgent right now. We do have a lot of openings, a lot of opportunity for change. So I think, given the sort of urgency, one open seat, potentially two more within the next 18 months, and at that point CPSC would lose a quorum, which it did earlier this century, and I don't think anybody's eager to repeat that. So given that, I think there will be more urgency to CPSC than there might otherwise be. I would anticipate somewhere around midsummer we'll see at least a chairman nominee. I suspect, I think the prudent course for the Biden administration to take would actually be to nominate people for all three of those seats at the same time, whether it's Elliott and two new faces or three new faces, just to sort of maximize the bang for the buck in the amount of administration and Senate time that has to be spent on CPSC. It's difficult, as Anne Marie Burkle and Nancy Beck have seen, it is difficult to get Senate time for an agency like CPSC, and I think having to do that just once instead of 3 times would be an advantage. The challenge the Biden administration will have is, as it stands, Commissioners Feldman and Biacco, the 2 Republican commissioners, are in office for years, for terms that last for several years. So there won't be a natural opportunity to pair a majority and minority nominee as frequently happens. There may be with some other agencies. There's been talk that one of those commissioners might depart early. That I think is just speculation at this point. So maybe that opportunity exists, but the pressure is going to be on to get nominees through an evenly divided Senate. Obviously, with Vice President Harris holding the gavel. But obviously, any nominee is going to have to be somebody who can be fairly close to a consensus. You're not going to be able to get any radical shifts in policy through this Senate. So again, I would expect as we move into the spring, we'll probably start hearing some names more concretely. And then as we get into summer, I would anticipate we'll finally get an actual nominee. Could be sooner, could be later. Again, the crystal ball is fuzzy.
Right. And I was just going to add to that, this is one of the situations where the Republican majority, former Republican majority in the Senate, never seems to have missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And they missed a big opportunity to really cement a Republican majority well through this Biden administration, but they failed in that. And that was clearly there was a Democratic strategy to drag feet and slow things down as much as possible. And quite amazingly, it succeeded. And again, it was also probably due to a challenging selection that was made on the Republican side that ran to a lot of headwinds from fellow Republicans in the then Republican Congress, which was pretty rare to see. And I think the only other thing I would add to Mike's comments, which I agree with, is it's always hard to know what's going to happen in this space. I mean, you could certainly see someone from the consumer advocate community with whom most of us are familiar through our work in ICFSO and maybe involved in this group. And I'm thrilled to see so many familiar names and faces on today's call. Or it could also just be a former congressman or a donor looking for a landing spot in the Biden administration. And so depending on how that plays out, it's really kind of amazing that that's really could define the fate of the CPSC for the next 4 years.
Yeah, Neil, and just to add, I think because there are 3 seats, I would be shocked if at least one of those didn't go to somebody none of us have ever heard of on this call, whether that is a donor or somebody from a broader public health community, not necessarily a product safety background. I think that is the opportunity to sort of shake the dynamics at CPSC, that you've got three bites at the apple right now, so one of them might be a surprise.
Okay, let me expand it to personnel. We've had some retirements. Gib Mullen retired, I've heard. Obviously, they'll need a replacement for that. Any comments on personnel changes that you're aware of or anticipate in light of the change of administrations?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Gib Mullen, and Gib Mullen is a great place to start. And Mike, maybe you could talk about the Ledge Affairs stuff in a moment, but Gib Mullen has been there for a number of years in a variety of capacities and just had a tremendous knowledge of the agency. And it was an interesting dynamic when he was asked to stay on as general counsel by acting chairman Adler, even after having he's clearly a Republican and served as the advisor with Anne Marie Burkle, but there was certainly a lot of mutual respect between the two individuals. And Gib has, I think, fully retired. And for those of you who haven't seen, former, I guess, deputy director to the Office of Compliance, Jennifer Sultan, has been pegged to be acting general counsel. And I've spoken to folks at the agency and met her actually at ICFSO this past February. And all I can say is she is extremely well liked and thought to be extremely bright. And I think that a lot of people are hoping that she could stay there in a full-time position. It's very early. It's only been a couple of weeks, but and she's only been at the agency herself for just over a year. So, but I think it's just sort of a testament to her position right now that she was able to take that. So that's one holdover. Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, and the other big gap that Neil mentioned is in legislative affairs. Chris Hudgens had come into that role with acting chairman Burkle, and again, much like Gib Mullen, he had a lot of credibility with both sides of the political aisle on at the commission, and so acting chairman Adler kept him in that role. He has now left, and Chairman Adler did bring in Carla McGarvey, who had been on the Hill, to take that role, I think, on a more permanent basis than GC. The key difference between those being that the legislative affairs director is somebody who serves just at the will of the chairman. The GC has to be appointed by the chairman, but then voted on by the commission. And I think because of that, and because of the uncertainty we just talked about around the commission level, I think we should anticipate that the Jen will be in that acting role probably until there is a new confirmed chairman, just because it's difficult to put people in that role in the first place, and then to go through that process, potentially twice within a matter of months. I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think ordinarily getting somebody in with a permanent title is more stable than somebody in an acting position. But I think in this unique circumstance, somebody who has that internal and external credibility that Jen does, regardless of the acting title, that's going to be the more stable approach to that position. So I wouldn't anticipate seeing a permanent GC until we have some resolution at the commission level. again, assuming that comes in the near term. Maybe eventually you have to just move on with what you got. But I think giving a new chairman, a new commission, an opportunity to make their mark through personnel is probably the way people will go.
And I'm sorry, Ken, I just want to sort of jump down a level, because I think these sort of like fancy titled positions, you know, yada yada, they're important. Obviously, these set a lot of policy at the agency, but a lot of the personnel changes that matter are often at the operational level and the compliance officer level. And there have been changes there, and there's been changes in the structure there. So, you know, I think many, but not all folks on this call are familiar with the fact that there was a major personnel sort of change under Commissioner Acting Chairman Adler and Director Rob K in the Office of Compliance. There's 2 Ks at CPSC. And, you know, there has been sort of an overhaul of the compliance function for the past couple of years, frankly. There's been a lot of tumult, I guess is the only way I could describe it. A lot of retirements, buyouts, people being gently pushed to the door, and then more generally a restructuring and what I would call a lawyering up of the compliance office. Traditionally, the way that the agency was designed was that you had your general counsel's office, and they were sort of like the lawyers up in the ivory tower who advised the commission, and then you had lawyers in the Office of Compliance who were sort of like the prosecutors to the cops who were the officers on the beat and the compliance officers. That structure had changed about 10 years ago under then Chairman Nord, and now Adler has thrown the attorneys back into the Office of Compliance, but he's actually taken it a step further. And so now in basically all non-fast track cases, their goal is to have an attorney-led investigation of those cases, which is a really different type of investigation than I think a lot of companies are used to in the CPSC space. Speaking as an attorney, attorneys are not always the best at letting details go, right? We want to get every last little nugget and every last little thing. And frankly, that slows things down a lot. And so I think and for any of you who have any cases pending, or your companies have any cases pending with the CPSC now, you have probably seen a major slowdown in moving out recalls. I know that I have in my practice. And I think that tension will continue to simmer and may come to a head in the coming years. I will tell you right now, due to another retirement in the Office of Compliance of staff person, the fast track office has just 4 current compliance officers running the entire fast track program, and with their supervisor, Phil Bermel. So there's been a lot of change on the defect side, and then there's also been change on the regulated side of the house as well. It's been a couple of years now that Mary Toro, the longtime director, has retired, and then a reorganization over there as well. So there's still some longstanding career staffers, but the leadership on the regulated side of the compliance team has changed a great deal, as has their philosophy of enforcement.
Yeah, and to your point, Neal, on the defect investigations, you know, the decision to move the lawyers back in, there are pros and cons to that. There are certainly arguments in favor of it. To me, putting the lawyers in charge of the investigations, again, pros and cons, but I think one thing we all anticipated was that things would slow down. That doesn't mean they're not being done well. I'm sure they are. They're being done properly. They're being done thoroughly. But just a contrast to other, you know, similarly positioned agencies, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, obviously they do motor vehicles. When they do defects and recall work, they specifically don't want the lawyers involved. They don't want the lawyers in the room because of this. They want engineers to talk to engineers and get the recall out quickly. Because while lawyers, speaking as one, I think we do have some virtues, but no one in history has ever said, I want to speed things up, let me add a lawyer. So to be fair to CPSC, the analogy for NHTSA is fast track. Those are situations where a recall is going to happen, and it's just a matter of making sure the remedy is right and the notification goes out properly. But we have, as Neal says, we've also seen the slowdowns in fast track, and some of that is loss of personnel. I do think some of it also is sort of a shift in focus in how the Office of Compliance more broadly is operating. So, I know it's very difficult for a company who has identified a potential problem or something they want to address, and they've put together a solution, they've got everything in place to get that going, and we just need the agency to move with, because this is all, every recall is better with CPSC's involvement. They have a larger platform, they have an expertise that is invaluable, but time is also invaluable. So I hope we can find some ways to address the concerns that motivated moving the lawyers back into compliance, while also addressing the concern of making sure recalls are getting out timely.
Yeah, and let me add something on that one, because I've had a variety of experiences over the last year with the attorneys moving in. In one situation, we've got a compliance officer, and then they assign the attorney on the matter, and I never hear from the attorney. I had another situation where I had no compliance officer. The attorney was the compliance officer, basically, and the attorney did the whole thing. It was very complex technical analysis, and she did a great job, I thought, and spent a lot of time reviewing it, asked good questions, and it got resolved. So I think it's fairly dependent on the lawyer, their background, their interests, the time they have available. But so I've seen just variability about the involvement of lawyers, in the past year at least. Okay, any other changes in the compliance? So we'll move into, we've already moved into enforcement and compliance group, and you've talked about that already. Any other change, other than the reorganization and the moving of the lawyers? Have you seen other changes that Rob Kay has instituted or thinking about instituting, and we of course don't know with new commissioners what they're going to want to do. So that's truly well too speculative. But any other changes you've seen just based on current personnel?
Sure, and I think one is a meta change that's coming from above Rob. It's coming from Bob Adler, who, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's a 2-2 commission and getting anything voted on is difficult, has seen the Office of Compliance under the purview of the chairman as the chief administrative officer of the agency as his opportunity to shift policy at the agency. I think the move of the lawyers is reflective of that. I've heard for several months, although I haven't seen anything yet, that the recall handbook is going to be substantially revised, and that fast track is going to get more rigorous in terms of what the expectations are for companies coming in the door, how much you have to have ready to go before you talk to CPSC, which does create some timing questions because it takes time to get things ready to go. And so are you, by definition, inviting companies to report late by getting everything in line for fast track? I think that's something that's got to be resolved, and maybe why the handbook changes are taking longer than I think some might have anticipated. We've also seen, and this is not unique to Bob Adler's time, this has been going on for about a decade, that the retailer reporting program, which was begun as a pilot program in the late aughts, I think we should all adopt the phrase aughts. I think it's good phraseology. It took off to some extent, had some successes in getting information to CPSC in more of a real-time fashion, weekly in the case of most of the participants. But there was a perception, I think, inside the agency that program hadn't driven a lot of recalls. There weren't a lot of recalls that happened solely because they were noticed in retailer reporting. And so that program is withering somewhere on between life support and entirely dead, which, as somebody who tends to represent manufacturers, I'm fine with that because we like to be in control of our data. But as just a CPSC policy matter, I think the agency has struggled, and Commissioners Feldman and Biacco have beaten the drum loudly that the agency has struggled to sort of modernize its data collection and analytics techniques. Obviously, a lot of that comes from the fact that the agency, I think just about everyone agrees, is woefully underfunded, which does make buying new computers a little bit difficult. So I think, in an era where CPSC is looking for opportunities to get better data, I think retailer reporting has been an unfortunate casualty of, both commission dynamics and funding. So I think we're seeing a commission moving towards a more regularized, formalized approach, which can be good for predictability, but also we've discussed the number of drawbacks that come with that, specifically time.
Okay. Neal, you got some comments
Yeah,
on
I'm
that?
waiting for some of your other questions, Ken. But one comment I have here before I want to jump into something else with your cue is the import side of the house, right? Which is very closely tied into compliance. Uh, you know, the Office of Import is very much the favored child of the CPSC. It is something that everyone loves. It's sort of a very clear cut. We're at the border. We're stopping 100% of quote unquote bad regulated stuff coming in. We then get to post nice seizure notices with customs and do press releases, hold up toys filled with lead and retweet that, and everyone feels really, really good about that. And as a result of it, that program, which has been run very well over the years, by the way, and is in many ways something that ought to be celebrated. So I don't mean to be too cheeky about it, because they have developed a very sophisticated targeting methodology. And for companies like the companies that are represented on these calls and ICFSO and places like that, companies that are compliance-driven, law-driven companies, this is a good thing, right? Because there are lots of smaller or less scrupulous companies that are trying to slip a fast one by the government. So having a good team on the border is important. During the most recent omnibus bill that was signed at the end of the year, there was a direction to increase the number of staff direct at the ports on behalf of CPSC. There's no additional funding given, but there was direction given. So it kind of does set up a tension. Well, where's that going to come from, right? And I think there's even whisperings of a hiring freeze right now as well, just because of the budget as well. So there is that tension. And the other tension in the import program is that they need things to look at, right? They're not allowed, under the way it's set up, to look for hazards or defects at the ports. So anytime that there's something new that they can put into their portfolio to examine for, you better believe they're going to do it. So the example that comes to mind right now, and it's a very simple example, but it's very current, and I do a lot of work with furniture manufacturers, is what was formerly known as the Safer Occupancy Furniture Flammability Act, or SOFA, which was snuck into the last 5 pages of the omnibus bill last year, making a national furniture flammability standard for the first time since the efforts began in 1968. Now, what it really is, it's really adoption of the California standard in a national way, but it requires the addition of a label that states complies with the US CPSC furniture flammability requirements. And that is something that the import team could very easily want to target. I mean, they love looking for tracking label violations because it is shooting fish in a barrel. It's easy. There's no question about the lead content or variability in the testing report. It's either there or it's not. So I think you'll, as that requirement phases in, you'll start to see enforcement on that as well, and other ways to justify the large amount of resources going to the import program and expanding that program to other ports of entry.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about civil penalties. Obviously, we had a timely civil penalty award, just to raise the subject. So, we've gone for what, almost 2 years without a civil penalty, I think. And now we had a big one. And between that and the fact that the lawyers are more involved on the compliance side, I want to ask both of you to talk about your predictions on future civil penalties and what that means for all of us who ponder whether to report and when to report. Mike, you can start.
Sure, and yeah, we did see not only a penalty, but we saw an odd amount of chatter from the commission itself around that penalty, and specifically before the penalty. We saw, Chairman Adler made an uncommon statement, though certainly not an unprecedented one, to say that the agency had referred a matter to justice to pursue. In fact, it almost is unprecedented in that the last time that happened, it was Chairman Elliott Kay, and he went further by actually naming the company and the alleged violation, whereas Chairman Adler left it to everybody to speculate. And I think the reason for that was that he was feeling pressure from his colleague, Commissioner Feldman, who has been tacking out sort of his law and order Republican sort of image at the commission since he arrived, and had been making a lot of noise about, wanting to see more penalties, wanting to see more defect investigation and enforcement actions. And I think that drove, I don't think that drove the decision. I think the commissioners made their own judgments on the propriety of referring that matter. But I think it did drive Chairman Adler to make, again, what was an uncommon public statement. And of course, that case was settled relatively quickly after the statement of its referral. And there were some interesting features to that case. Not only, obviously, the number $12.4 million is substantial, at least in terms of the range of penalties CPSC can impose, or can pursue rather. But we also saw a couple of other charges in there that aren't in a whole lot of cases. We saw a material misrepresentation charge, and we saw a misuse of a certification mark charge. And I think those are going to be areas that CPSC is going to want to explore more frequently. I think we've gotten very used to CPSC pursuing late reporting and virtually nothing else, with a few exceptions for sale of recalled products. I think we're going to see more activity in those spaces, in part because I think it can be useful to drive companies to maybe be a little more aggressive in their own pursuit of a settlement. Late reporting is a fuzzy sort of thing that we don't like, but we will deal with that as needs to be dealt with. But anytime you start throwing around words like misrepresentation, I think people get a lot more sensitive. And so we saw a trend toward that with misrepresentation charges just sort of floating around with a variety of settlements. And then there was one fairly significant example from a few years ago where a settlement was rejected at the commission level, specifically because it did not include a misrepresentation element. So I think staff is looking more closely at some of the other portions of CPSC statutes that have been traditionally perhaps under-enforced. I would, as somebody who's written on the subject of Section 37 and would like that writing not to entirely be in vain and whistling into the wind, I think Section 37 is a space where CPSC might get more active in the future. I think there's a general perception that there are concerns of compliance across industries with that particular section of the law. So I think, again, consistent with the overall theme of a more active, more aggressive CPSC, I think we're going to see more activity in civil penalties. In part, again, we said Peter Feldman wants to be law and order enforcement. That's an opportunity where, despite a 2-2 commission, you might be able to find 3 or perhaps 4 votes for something, and that's for penalties where the commission feels the conduct deserves them.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that. There's sort of this very interesting sort of like toughing each other out dynamic going on between Acting Chairman Adler and Commissioner Feldman, where one's saying, well, I'm tougher on the companies, I'm tougher on enforcement. And it's sort of funny and unanticipated. I mean, I think folks of us in the product safety community are, I guess, challenged by the idea that Bob Adler doesn't go tough enough on companies and enforcement. But that was certainly the perception that Commissioner Feldman was stating, not even trying to put out there, but stating in no explicit terms. I think one of the other really interesting things about that case is, to Mike's point, not just on the timeliness, but really on the adequacy of the reporting, right? And that you can't just, companies can't just sort of put in a minimal full report and sort of gloss over some of the details that could arguably be material. And in this case, if you read it, you're talking about, by a factor of 10, 4 million versus 40 million units, the amount of fire extinguishers that arguably were supposed to have been recalled at an earlier date, or it depends on the exact math. But the fact is, trying to downplay the seriousness of an issue, which I think it's fair to frame things in the way that's most favorable to the company. That's fine. That's what we all do, but still providing the information and perhaps if not providing that information, I think that was one of the more interesting takeaways of that case, is really studying the adequacy of that report as well. So go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, as part of that settlement agreement, there was the typical requirements for the company to establish a safety program. And, you know, us all being safety professionals, that's of interest. Is this CPSC, do you think they're going to get more serious about requiring that? Or would it behoove a company to establish a safety program similar to what the CPSC requires in their settlement agreements? And would that give them some leverage in the event of future late reporting issues that might pop up? So at least we had a good safety program in place. You know, here's why we made a decision to do this or do that. Do you
Well,
think that any message from that in that settlement agreement?
I mean, they've been putting that language in there now for almost a decade. And in that decade, aside from one PowerPoint put out by the staff, they've never really fleshed out what that means, right? And so there's this idea of like, you need this safety program. And of course, companies do. You do need a safety program. You have to make sure that you are monitoring and gathering that information in a singular place and making sure that it's reviewed and escalated appropriately and stop sales are put into place. You need that. And you have to have your policies to have that in place. But at the same time, if it fails, CPSC is by its nature going to say it was inadequate, right?
Right.
So yes, there is something to be said about having that in place as a mitigating factor. At the same time, in CPSC's PowerPoint, what the staff put out on their compliance programs a few years ago, they also acknowledge that product safety is a process of continual improvement. And I think that's a key acknowledgement. If you go, as we all know that intuitively as product safety professionals, and that one of the biggest mistakes you can make in the world of product safety is being overwhelmed and by making a product safety program and not starting by making your first policy, right? And that policy is going to iterate, that policy is going to improve over time. And all the ISO standards acknowledge that as well, and CPSC acknowledges that. So I think, you know, those are arguments that lawyers can make, and I think they're also the truth, right? So I think, yes, you have to have a program in place. Yes, that program is going to be continually improving. Yes, that program can still fail, and yes, CPSC can still hold that against you. So all of the above can be true at the same time.
Right. I agree. I don't know that it, you know, it does cut both ways in negotiations, because not only can CPSC say it was inadequate, they can say, well, you have a sophisticated product safety program and you still missed the boat on this one, so we're going to hold you to a higher standard than somebody who's never heard the word product safety. But I do think, obviously, from a substantive standpoint, yes, absolutely, you should have a safety and compliance program, because whatever its value in the negotiations for a penalty, ideally, it's going to keep you out of those negotiations in the first place. So absolutely, that's valuable. Neal's right. This language has been coming in since way back when I was working for Commissioner Nord, and she was complaining not about the substance, but about the process. You know, she said, if you're going to be doing this, you need to be doing it in public and establish these principles and not just lump them into settlements, which I think is a fair point. Of course, we're all dancing around the phrase voluntary recall rule because you don't want to say that 3 times. You might summon the thing back up into existence. I do think, looping back to our discussion of commission personnel, though, I think that is it's going to be, especially if the chairman or any of the new commissioners is somebody from this field, from this world, I think addressing all of these concerns we've been talking about, whether it's the speed of recalls, whether it's the adequacy of information that comes into the agency, the form of information, I think getting back into something like some kind of regularization of the voluntary recall process is likely to be a very active field of debate, because, again, everybody from all sectors has had some concerns for a while about how recalls are coming together. And I think this notion of what a compliance program, what a safety program should look like is part and parcel to that discussion.
Ken,
Okay.
before we move on, can I say one more thing? Because I know you want to move on to, but I feel like we jumped over this, and but it's part of this conversation, which is, you know, how is enforcement going to change under this administration, even on a level of enforcing on recalls, let alone civil penalties? And, you know, in my experience, I know there's this general preconception that, oh, under a Democratic administration, it's going to be more enforcement. Under Republican administration, there's going to be less enforcement. And I don't always agree with that. I take a bit of a contrarian view on that. I think on high profile matters, there may be a distinction, things that reach the level of the commission. And on rulemaking, if you're in an industry where there has been a rule that's been kicking around in some sort of proposed form or function for the last 3 to 5 years, the likelihood of that rule being picked up and moved forward, I think, is certainly greater in what will presumably be a Biden commission once the nominations go through. But on a day-to-day operational level of the processing of cases that most of us are familiar with, I think it's pretty much the same until something becomes politicized. Then all bets are off. But the favorite thing I like to tell my clients is, look, if you need to know the names of the commissioners, then I'm doing my job wrong, because you never want your case to be in front of a commissioner. You want your case to be in front of the correct staff member who understands the facts and the science and the merits, makes a decision, makes a recommendation to their supervisor, and hopefully gets it adopted. That's where you want to be. And I think that will remain unchanged. And I think that's important to be said at any time that there's a change in administration. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay. Yeah, and let me just say, on the issue of the CPSC's approach to having companies institute product safety programs and what might be deemed adequate, that's for another webinar. We'll talk about that one later, because that gets to the issue of how do we figure, because I think everybody on this phone call knows what a good product safety program looks like, and hopefully many of your companies have it. But a lot of companies struggle, and particularly when they're starting out, of where do I start? What do I do? And trying to learn some lessons from what the CPSC is interested in as product safety professionals, what effect this has on product liability if you have any cases, and potential punitive damages. There are a lot of things that can help companies decide what is most important in setting up a product safety program. But again, we'll do that later in a later webinar. Okay, one more topic, and then we'll stop for questions. Rulemaking priorities. A lot of things going on. Obviously, Neal, you mentioned furniture. We've got other things going on. I guess they're on my list here. Table saws. They've been talking table saws for what, 20 years now, I think. Safety devices. So what do either of you think is going on with rulemaking at the CPSC? Neal, you can start.
I'll start, and Mike, obviously feel free just to interrupt and jump in. I mean, the other part about furniture, we can talk about table saws. That's a pet project of Chairman Adler, and he's kept it alive to the oncoming of a new Democratic administration. So we may see some rulemaking on table saws, which is a sort of a niche thing, unless you're a table saw manufacturer, in which case it's pretty important. And when you read that briefing package, it's always shocking just how many people's fingers and digits are cut off every year through table saws. It's pretty appalling. The other piece, though, that I want to mention, which it's no surprise to people on this call, but it's the other side of furniture, not furniture upholstered flammability, but furniture tip over. And that has been certainly over the last 4 years, really where a lot of the action has been with CPSC and pushing the envelope and really trying to create a new standard of care and expectation in that area of the industry, whether it be through voluntary standards, through recalls. There have been a number of recalls. There have been some policy statements that have come out of the CPSC. Former Chairman Burkle put out a statement actually at ICFSO a few years ago saying, we are now considering failure to comply with ASTM F2057 to be a defect and a hazard. Now, so we're expecting a rulemaking to come out on that. That's in the operating plan. However, there is the equally likely option that simply it'll happen in Congress, like what just happened with furniture flammability. There was a bill that the acronym was called the Sturdy Act, and that has not succeeded, but certainly given the change in politics, that would be a way for the commission to avoid a lengthy rulemaking process, probably get a lot of what they want, although usually when Congress gets involved, the staff is not always thrilled with the technical outcome that they've been working on for the prior 2 to 3 years. So that's one issue that we certainly see as there will definitely be movement on. I can almost predict in the next 12 to 18 months, something is going to happen on that front. Mike?
Yeah, and
Mike,
that one, just
go ahead.
one quick note on that, that one is less subject to this whole caveat of the entire discussion of the commission turnover than others, because there has been a lot of consensus across the commissioners on the need to address this issue. There's been some discussion about the right way to do it, what the standards should be, what regulatory vehicle they should use, but there has been consensus that this is the #1 priority for CPSC. So I agree, something's coming sooner rather than later.
Okay. Well, let's do this. See if there's some questions. We have one more topic we could get into, but let's stop as I promised and see if we're going to have some questions that have been submitted by folks. Loudon, can you help us out here?
Currently, we do not have any questions. And so now would be a great time for you guys to start sending in your questions in the chat.
And while we're waiting for that, Ken, one other regulatory area that I expect some movement on is ATVs. Obviously, that's been a product that's been of interest for CPSC for decades and has driven some of the more high-profile moves around CPSC since the late 80s. But we've also seen over the last several years, Australia has adopted new requirements for rollover protective devices on ATVs. The consequence of that for Australia has been 3 manufacturers have exited the market because of the difficulties of that particular requirement and frankly, some significant questions about the actual efficacy of it from a safety standpoint. But nonetheless, Chairman Adler, as that Australian rulemaking process was going forward, he expressed a lot of interest in it and sort of suggested he might be on board with some of the requirements it was imposing. So I would not be the least bit surprised to see something like that showing up either at CPSC or on the Hill, which has been sort of a more fruitful ground for product safety issues the last couple of years.
I would agree, although the political challenges around ATVs remain. Historically, there have been, it's sort of been bipartisan. I mean, Commissioner Adler has said for years that CPSC could be the ATV safety agency and save more lives and avoid more injuries than anything else the commission does cumulatively, right? So, and frankly, the data probably supports that statement. But still, it does, Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, is from Minnesota. Mike, you're familiar with a company up there that makes ATVs. And so there's just been historically a political stopgap that has stopped and protected that industry from regulation.
There has been, and we've seen this in other industries, once you have another country, another jurisdiction that does something, and actually some of that thought process has been making its way to the EU with regards to the rollover protective devices. Once you start getting those other jurisdictions, it's a little bit easier in the US to point to, well, Australia is doing it, we should be doing it too. So I think that may change the dynamic a little bit around ATVs, and you're not talking, at first blush, you're not talking about a radical redesign of the product. It actually is a radical redesign of the product, but it doesn't look like it. So I think the sales job is going to be a little bit easier at a policy level, and so I expect people are going to wade into those issues.
Now, former Commissioner Mohorovic is, jazzing us in the chat box over there, and really, forcing me to choose between all of my favorite children, my commissioners. Who would be the favorite? Obviously we love we love Joe, and thank you for your service, and also thank you for your question, which is this concept of what is sometimes known as backdoor rulemaking, which is if the agency can't actually accomplish the rulemaking directly through the proper procedures, then they effectively rulemake by doing recalls, right? And so you've seen this in the past, initially with like drop side cribs 10 or 11 years ago, which eventually changed the rules. And so that has always historically been attention as well. And certainly as the examples that are in the chat with furniture and hoverboards, I think those are also very good examples. And frankly, the attempt at what happened with furniture tip over, but that is now proceeding obviously through formal channels. We got a question from Al Kaufman, and we were, we're talking about this as well. It's on our list of things to talk about, which is 6B, and whether 6B, for those of you who are not lawyers or have gotten too deep into CPSC, is an information protection area of the law that is unique to CPSC and the federal government, and that requires the CPSC to take extra measures to protect manufacturers' information and to give manufacturers an opportunity to review that information before it's disclosed publicly. That has been a favorite target of consumer advocates, and they basically believe that quote unquote 6B kills by the delay of information to the public. And certainly there's been a move to legislate the end of 6B. Mike, what is your feeling about that?
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for avoiding the hard part of that question. So obviously you're right. 6B has been a focus of attention ever since the CPSA was enacted in 1972. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. We saw Bobby Rush had a bill last Congress that would remove the opportunity for companies to seek an injunction to prevent CPSC from disclosing information. Of course, that's not an injunction people pursue very often. So I don't know what the practical impact of that bill would have been. But I do suspect that as CPSC issues continue to move through this Congress, and I think there will be a more of a focus on CPSC than in most Congresses, just because it's been now 13 years since CPSIA, that 6B will be part of the discussion. What shape that will take, I don't know. The last time we did this in 2008, there was an effort to repeal it entirely, and then there was a compromise at cutting the notice periods in half. So I'm not sure where the compromises at this point lie, if there are any. So there will certainly be debate around 6B to the extent there is a broader CPSC reform package, which I anticipate, then 6B will play some role in that, and we'll just have to wait and see what shape that actually takes. The one thing Neal mentioned that I do want to annotate, not necessarily disagree with, is he mentioned that 6B is unique among federal health and safety agencies, which it is. But the counterpoint to that is that CPSC's access to information via Section 15B is also broader than just about any federal health and safety agency. And in fact, again, NHTSA is one of the closest parallels to CPSC. And when the TREAD Act came along through its early warning reporting requirements and gave NHTSA access to a scope of information that still didn't approach CPSC's access, but got closer to it, NHTSA then through rulemaking realized that a lot of that information is both unreliable from a safety perspective because it's necessarily premature and frequently unvalidated, and two, is highly confidential information that whatever its value to the agency is not something companies are always willing to share publicly for a variety of reasons, including competitive reasons, and thus protected all of that as confidential business information. So as soon as an agency gets a little fraction of what CPSC gets, they recognize that we need to be careful with how we treat this information. Again, it's of value to the agency to make policy decisions, to make recall decisions, but it is highly sensitive. So, I never like that part getting left out of this conversation, that yes, CPSC has a different mandate because it also has a different mandate, and not all ducks quack the same.
Neal, you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. Now we had a question in there, and I can only see on the screen about half the question. So there was a question about the changes in the recall handbook. I'm not sure. Did you see what the question was? Is what,
Yeah.
like, what's going to happen, or what are they going to be, or who's working on it?
So, and again, I have been hearing for at least 10 months that a new recall handbook was coming within weeks, which, obviously we're at a substantial number of weeks at this point. So, it could be that has been shelved. It could be that it's still working its way through what can be a very challenging process. The changes are all, to my understanding, around the front end, around what the information should look like and what its scope should be when it comes into CPSC. And it's mostly focused on fast track. It is mostly focused on making sure that when any fast track issue comes to CPSC, it is essentially as turnkey as it can possibly be. And, I alluded earlier, that does create some tension. This came up in the Spectrum penalty litigation a few years ago, where the question was raised actually by the judge, said, hey, companies like this can't move within a matter of 48 hours to get a recall together. It's just the nature of entities, regardless of private sector, public sector, whatever. aren't you by definition, when you come in with a recall ready to go, aren't you by definition reporting late because you took the time to put this together? And I think that's the tension that this change in the recall handbook, which frankly is reflective of the way CPSC's statute is structured, I think that's the tension it's placing on everyone from companies to the agency, that it's best for CPSC, it's best for companies, it's best for consumers if companies can come in the door with a recall ready to go, but then that creates a problem with the statute. We saw, back to legislation, we saw the FASTER Act last year, fortunately didn't even get out of committee, but it was an effort to give CPSC essentially NHTSA-like recall authority to say, company comes in, we have an issue, we want to recall. All CPSC is expected to do at that point would be to make sure that the communication's in the right order, it's going to go out in a way that's effective, but the substance of it, CPSC is leaving to the companies to get right. Right now, the Act positions CPSC as much more of a gatekeeper and creates an obligation for CPSC to dig in to a level that is not consistent with getting recalls out quickly. So I think CPSC recognizes that, recognizes where some of the delays are in the process. Some of them they can't fix. Again, the statutory structure. One thing they can fix is to put more pressure on companies to come in with more information, with more formalized recall plans when they come in the door. And to my understanding, that's where these recall handbook changes would be headed.
And also increased focus on social media and communications as well, you'll see in there.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would say that there will be a later webinar on recall preparedness, which is the part of any good product safety program, even if you've never had a recall before. But I wanted to ask you, Mike and Neal, CPSC has talked for, I'll say decades probably, it's probably going back 20 years now, about improving recall effectiveness. I remember going back to the Ed Hayden study, and which was, I think, 93, or I mean, it was a long time ago. And then the CPSC has claimed they were going to come out with documents talking about how to improve the effectiveness of your recall. Now, maybe that's part of the handbook, but they were talking about something fairly narrow and fairly specific, policy guidelines or whatever they were. And are you aware of anything on that front that the CPSC is talking about doing to improve that and give guidance to companies on improving recall effectiveness?
Not right now, no. I mean, we're running out of time, but I think the speed issue is a really important issue. And I think that's one of the answers to improving recall effectiveness is getting the recalls out more closely in time to when the products were sold and taken off the market. And so whether you're looking at NHTSA or FDA, if you walk into FDA and want to do a medical device recall tomorrow, it's going to be posted tomorrow. And if you go to Health Canada and you say you have an issue, you're going to have that thing posted very shortly. And Health Canada is basically, in my experience, is throwing up their hands at CPSC's own process and moving forward because CPSC's communications and lawyer review takes such a long time that it's, and frankly, clients just don't want to wait for it, right? You don't want, if safety is the goal, speed is critical to that goal. And not to say that there aren't other things that require investigation and due diligence, especially if there's going to be a repair and part of that remedy. But I see we're losing people, or it's about to be the top of the hour, but I think speed is critical to that.
It is, and to your point, all those other agencies are just conduits for recalls, or they can certainly initiate investigations on their own. But in all those other agencies, if a company comes to the agency wanting to do a recall, the only job for the agency is to amplify that message and make sure it reaches people. CPSC is stuck with a heavier burden by its statute that I think does slow things down. In terms of concrete solutions on recall effectiveness, I haven't heard a lot. Obviously, the activity around the voluntary recall rulemaking was at least ostensibly geared toward making recalls more effective. The one thing I think we did see from the recall effectiveness workshop that CPSC had 3-4 years ago, I think, was some deeper dive data from the agency on what motivates recall behavior. I think one of the lessons from that kind of everybody already knew was one thing that hampers CPSC recall effectiveness rates versus, say, NHTSA is cars cost $10, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 and more. When there's a problem with it, you're going to go get that problem fixed. When you buy a consumer product for $2, you're not sending it back. You're not doing any of the things that are necessary to fulfill a recall in the way that CPSC can track and document and add to their statistics. You're probably just going to throw it in the trash can. And no one's ever going to hear about that, but it was an effective recall because the hazard is now removed from your house. So I think that's one of the difficulties CPSC has in addressing its recall effectiveness rate, is just how to frame that question. How do we capture the people who just get rid of the product? And hopefully, as we evolve that, it won't just be a discussion of the solution. We will start discussing how do we ask the right question, because I think that's where we're failing right now, is not asking the right question about recall effectiveness.
Okay, well, and again, that'll be the subject of a future webinar, to talk about the real narrow subjects. That's the beauty of these kinds of webinars. We can really focus in on some narrow topics, and those who are interested can join. All right, let me turn it back over to Loudon to say goodbye. And thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and it will be on the SPSP website next week. And so we hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. Bye.